I'm really happy to co-host this panel along with my colleague Anuradha Chenoy. The panel is organized by BRICS Feminist Watch in partnership with AEPF, that is Asia Europe People's Forum, the South Asian University based in Delhi, and Program on Women's Economic Social Culture Rights.
We're all delighted to be here, and I'm very honored to be a co-moderator. Now, of course, there is an ongoing a kind of a global conversation that there should be, this last kind of very rigid institution of security and foreign policy should open its doors to more women, but they call it a feminist foreign policy. Now, I think as feminists and how I personally see it, that of course, there must be more women in foreign policy making institutions, in the strategic community, the echo chamber around foreign policies. And we can see that, I mean, the kind of context in international politics today, where it's not a world war, but the world is at war, at several wars. And we as feminists are deeply concerned about these. So we are making an argument that, of course, that women should be part of foreign policy making structures, but that foreign policy should also have feminist principles. And how states are looking at this will be contextualized by our wonderful panelists and speakers. I'm so looking forward to it. So I'm not going to go on about my own comments, but first I would ask Emilia Reyes from Mexico. She's already been introduced by Priti. So Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be in this panel with all of you. I think my points of view are very general in the sense that I have a big opposition to the notion of feminist foreign policy, especially in the global north countries. I think that we can benefit from a position of feminist foreign policy in the global south, especially the situation and the imbalance of power that there is globally. But overall, I think it is very hypocritical of global north countries to state that they have a foreign policy when they haven't challenged any of the agendas that they impose on the rest of the global south. And furthermore, they are now co-opting, as they always do. They're co-opting our terms, they're co-opting our agenda for a liberal, white liberal vision at the best, or a criminal conservative policy at worst. And so the cooptation of a feminist notion is very concerning to me and many of us. And also, it is also concerning to us, not only the cooptation by states, but also the complicity of some of our colleagues in the global north who are accompanying those global north states with a white liberal lens of what should be feminism. And so therefore they're not literally tackling the harm that these governments are doing in the global south. So I think there is this counterposition, right, of what does, as a whole, we can also wonder if a state can be feminist. But from my point of view, I'm a feminist from Latin America. We do ascribe to the tradition of a feminism of rupture, meaning that we don't think that women should be included in the current economic system as it is. We think that this system is predatory, exclusionary. It generates more inequalities across the world. So the feminism of inclusion, it's something that we do not accompany. And so therefore, I think the question of which type of feminism can accommodate foreign feminist policy is also something that we can ask ourselves, because there are some self-acclaimed feminism that are precisely as what we have been starting to hear already in this webinar, right? That to say that women should be included in decision-making positions, that women should be included in the current system as it is, in the employment patterns, women should be included in the army, women should be included in the harmful structures, that in, you know, mining structures, etc. And so this notion of inclusion of women as if it were feminists, it's extremely problematic to our sense. Of course, we do believe that women should be decision makers because it is our right, because we are citizens, because we are 50% of the population. So there are some demands that are very basic, and I think we all accompany them in principle. But why are we in need to call them feminist, especially in alignment with the state? I think that's a major question. And on the other hand, also, I have a very critical position on our colleagues, as I said, who accompany this agenda within their global north countries, because they say that they are using these to hold their governments accountable. But this is something that they should be doing in the first place anyway. They don't need to use our name and our term of feminist so that they hold their countries accountable. We do that anyway in the South, and we are not branding our states as feminists just because we try to hold them accountable. That should happen immediately, and that is something that we are still waiting for our colleagues in the global north to do, precisely because with all of the harm that the global north countries are doing in our territories, it is quite clear that they're not holding accountable. Especially, I think there is also this difference about what are the agendas that they are being allowed to address when they're talking about feminist foreign policy. And even if global north countries talk about peace and security, again, that involves women in consultations and stuff, and not the bigger picture that we're seeing, for instance, of enabling a genocide in Gaza, enabling the invasion of Lebanon and Syria, allowing the Sudanese genocide to go on. So these are really elements that put at stake the lives of Black and Brown people. And so this conversation, I think it is a very critical one, just because we say from some positions in the global south, not in our name, stop doing that. And on the other hand, as I said, I do say that global south countries do benefit from having a feminist foreign policy, just because they are in such a weak imbalance of power that it allows some countries that are trying to do some transformation in the global arena, that it will allow them to sit in a different table, that will allow them to push for some of the agendas that are at the bare minimum of what the global south needs, and that we as feminists from the global south have been pushing for all of this time. But it's also, I just want to be very clear that we as feminists, civil society, as social movements, we don't give them the name of feminists to our states. They themselves are allocated that brand, and if they decide to pursue that, we are happy to sit down with them and draft what would be the main priorities. But it is not up to us to call another one feminist, because that is also extremely problematic. We do not legitimize how feminist is a state. I think that is also something that has to come very strongly. And I'm still to hear feminists from Mexico who say that our state is feminist. I don't think that is something that I've heard, but I have heard with in people in the global north saying with a lot of pride that their governments have a feminist foreign policy. And I think that is precisely the misleading path in which we fall into then confusing an agenda with the different roles and actors, and also we end up legitimizing harmful deeds. So in the case of Mexico, they have been indeed, I've seen it with my own hands, with my own eyes, they have been indeed going out until the final moments in several negotiations, because they have
Emilia, you have 1 minute, huh? 1 minute.
They have a commitment with the feminist foreign policy. What is it that they can do in the context of the global realities in which the language is being negotiated to the minimum, and we are seeing a strong backlash. And so when our countries are saying they're defending a feminist agenda, what they're really defending is the basic language. And they're saying that at the final moments, because many countries are actually attacking our agenda. So we do need, of course, a strong alliance of countries globally in negotiation to push for whatever it is that we have gained and whatever advancements that we can make in the global arena. But it is, we cannot just set, because of the context, call our countries feminist. I think this is something that also we need to be mindful. So in the global arena, the way that we are seeing the challenges, many countries can allocate themselves a name of feminist. I can say that Mexico has been pushing for many radical agendas, including abortion in the Beijing Plus 25 framework of UN Women. We will see how this will happen in the next Beijing Plus 30. But overall, it is our duty as feminists from the Global South and civil society to keep on pushing our governments, regardless if they're naming themselves feminists. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emilia. Thank you for going right into the heart of the issue. And I must admit, I agree with a lot of what you said, but also, the question I'm also raising for others and for you is the question of choice. What kind of choice should women do? Do they have autonomy of choice of joining security structures, or should they, be presented with more feminist options? So our next speaker really is Christa. She's already been introduced from Germany. Christa, the floor is yours.
Let me start with a personal remark. I have a long history of engagement with the German Ministry of Development Cooperation to influence development policies from a gender perspective. Of course, women's visibility, gender equality, and women's rights were a crucial motivation in the beginning. However, over time, my focus shifted very much to macroeconomy, trade policies, the post-colonial inequality between global North and global South, and the structural impact on women's livelihoods and rights. With regard to individual empowerment of women and gender equality, feminist lobbying was in the long run pretty successful. Feminist principles regarding macroeconomy and geopolitics were not. Next slide, please. The official guidelines of German FFP from 2023 claim that it is value-based, aims at gender equality and enforcement of women's rights. It wants to overcome violence and to transform historically grown power structures. The focus is on 3R: representation, rights, resources. Crucial reference is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the UN Resolution 1325. It sees women as agents of change, for example, in the Green New Deal, and wants to cooperate on equal footing. Despite of most likely good intentions and a declared intersectional approach, the guidelines ignore the framework of unequal power. No reference is made to the prevailing dominance of Western geopolitics, economic interests, or post-colonial power asymmetries, meaning it delinks feminist policies of its material and ideological context and conditions, and is based on the self-conception of the EU as a value-based normative power. Yes, this is the right slide. First of all, foreign policy is governed by national economic and geopolitical interests, and this confines the space in which feminist policies can maneuver. My first example for the dilemma between rhetorics and reality is migrant policies. Recently, Germany adopted the strategy of pushback at the borders, restrictions in granting asylum, and attempts to deport more refugees. Bureaucratic barriers by German institutions have prevented even Afghan and Iranian feminists from entering the country. These policies knowingly put up with the death of thousands of migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. One of the prevailing narratives is that European values have to be protected against others, in particular Muslim cultures, and white women against the attacks of violent young male migrants from the Middle East. All this blatantly contradicts feminist principles on intersectional vulnerabilities, human rights, and anti-racism. As migration and asylum policies are highly contested in Europe, the German Minister for Foreign Affairs in international negotiations has no choice but to address the official goals of German migration and foreclosure policies. My second example for an appalling contradiction between rhetorics and reality is the ongoing militarization and trade in arms. Since the beginning of the war between Ukraine and Russia, an appalling trend to militarization in the interior has taken place, constructing a mindset to be ready for war. Military budget increases, social budget is cut down. The export of arms was doubled, not only to the Ukraine and Israel, but to authoritarian states like Saudi Arabia, famous for violation of women's rights and coalition with Islamistic forces, and to Turkey, which fights the Kurdish opposition with German weapons. Beyond the double standards, selling arms to these conflict parties contributes to the intensification of conflicts, proactively supports the stronger party, and gives economic interest preference to moral Western standards. Nationalism, militarization, and preparedness for war are normalized and interwoven in a violent, masculinistic way. They undermine all feminist principles of peace, anti-violence, and conflict resolution. The next one, the most striking example of national interest, German, and of double standards is the fight against anti-Semitism and pro-Israel, which the current German government, due to its historic guilt of the Holocaust, has coined a moral reason for the German state. In an increasingly authoritarian way, any pro-Palestinian statement and any critique of the Israeli state and its settler colonialism is called anti-Semitic. On this background of behaving like an imperial moral police, an authoritarian cancel culture has been launched, removing paintings from exhibition, disinviting feminists like Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler from public events, banning slogans from the river to the sea, and the BDS campaign. While the German government still refuses to pay reparations to compensate for the genocide of the Nama and Herero people in Namibia, this way of moral rehabilitation implies that the ongoing genocidal war and its victims in Gaza are not openly condemned. So Germany officially sticks to the two-state solution and proposes a ceasefire. To sum up, German feminist foreign policy is informed by liberal feminism, which wants to integrate or include, as Emilia has said, include women often as underpaid workers into existing political and economic structures, into markets for the sake of growth and profit-making, into political decision-making, the Green New Deal, peace building, and so on. Women's work and women's rights are sometimes used to legitimize geopolitical goals, as experienced in Afghanistan, and feminism is in a neoliberal way appropriated for national capitalist and environmental interests. Feminist foreign policy is nothing but a nice label, or better, a fraud label, however, a structural paradox, because it wields the material and ideological power play in foreign policies and the real deficit of space to negotiate. It is femo-nationalistic, suggesting a moral and knowledge superiority of a supposedly homogeneous European or German feminism, and legitimizing Germany to give directions to the rest of the world how to do foreign policies. This is a neocolonial, paternalistic, and imperialistic attitude, arrogant and ignorant against the diversity of feminisms and against other values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christa, for opening the debate and showing the connection between those who value feminist principles in the North and South, the genuine, the essence of feminism, which is international, that we share. And so now we have this wonderful speaker, Radhika Coomaraswamy from Sri Lanka, and personally, I really am delighted to be able to hear her. Radhika?
Thank you very much for inviting me here with all of you. I am really listening to what people are saying. I want to look at it from something that has been troubling me, being in the international arena. So I want to look at it from the perspective of the global South. First, of course, I think we have to ask ourselves, what do you mean by feminism when we're saying our comments? And for me, it was always a professor of mine who saw feminism much more as a critique. And so one of the first things we have to do is to critique the foreign policies of our countries from its ideology and structure with feminist ideals in place. Now, the origins of feminist foreign policy as a term was Margot Wallström in Sweden, and it spread to other countries. And I think there was a good faith attempt. She wanted gender equality and human rights in the way Swedish foreign policy was conducted, and to transform diplomacy in that image. But however, it was linked by her situation, which is in the North, and it was really, in the end, turned up linking aid to women's rights. And one of the issues she got very caught up in and led to a problem was arms shipments to Saudi Arabia, which she objected to, but the rest of the government did not feel that there was anything wrong. But there are some aspects of Northern foreign policy that maybe we can look at. One is the demand for equal representation, which is the first principle of feminist foreign policy for the North, and the representation of women in all aspects of international life. They focus a lot. I was on the global study on WPS, on peace negotiations and peacekeeping and peace building. But while I was doing that study, I realized there's a tremendous Northern preoccupation of putting women in the military and also in peacekeeping. And I kept arguing that, in the South, our militaries are by no means places that are living up to noble values. So this notion of representation also is something we have to think about in terms of foreign policy. The second principle of feminist foreign policy that they put forward is, of course, the principle of human security, and that it's not about military national security, but human security, not about military hardware and playing Russian roulette or whatever, but a broader concept of security, which is people-centered, which includes national security, but also food, health, education. But of course, the problem is that this term human security often is used to glide over differences and divisions and conflicts in society. But anyway, that is a principle we should consider that came out of the Northern experiment with feminist principles of foreign policy. And the third, of course, is recognizing the interconnectedness of the world, and that national sovereignty is not the only goal, but it must give way to human rights and social justice and climate change. And it's not about balance of power or double standards. So those are some of the principles that came out of the North that were positive. But I think in the end, it was the dilemmas of Northern feminists as it worked out. It was the sale of arms, granting of aid, programs for peace building. And I think the global South comes from a very different place. Now, the Global South has strong feminist movements, all with their own vision. I can only say what I come from my own experience and location, which is as an academic who has experience in the national arena. And for me, the most important thing, perhaps, from the Global South is decolonizing foreign policy. And to deal with the theme of political decolonization first, and we question the South constantly as the recipient of aid and intervention and the demand that we be equal partners in the political international spaces such as the Security Council, not only for Southern governments, but also for Southern women. I don't know if any of you saw the speech by the president of Barbados at the General Assembly, challenging double standards, calling out genocide and atrocities. So I think we have to recognize that political decolonization is still not complete and should be an essential part of the foreign policy of Southern countries. The second is, of course, economic decolonization, aspects of trade and debt, especially debt. The feminist foreign policy must be actively involved in the Southern countries in the debt justice movement to get fairer deal that protects social protection and fights poverty in developing countries. So I would argue that that's an important part of the foreign policy of the Southern countries, and especially the impact of things like debt on women. So I would say that that should be an important part of Southern feminist foreign policy. And of course, decolonization culturally. Decolonization, as you know, has a cultural aspect. A feminist foreign policy needs to develop what's been done recently to return material and artifacts from the North and other things that have been robbed from Southern countries. There are international conventions that exist, but at the moment it's dealt with only bilaterally. Maybe we need an international convention, a proper process. So there are those kinds of issues also that are important for Southern concepts of foreign policy. And then very central to Southern foreign policy must be intersectionality. I mean, our societies are so diverse, and especially as one of the speakers mentioned, when we think about refugees, the stateless, the undocumented, the illegal, the migrant workers, the trafficked victims. I mean, a Southern feminist foreign policy cannot give up on them. It must be actively involved to protect their rights and their interests, and recognizing the diversity and the vulnerability among us. And then, of course, there's Northern activists involved in feminist foreign policy. A lot of it was around aid and giving to peace building. And what they would do is give aid for livelihood schemes within national action plans for countries emerging from conflict. But more I am in Sri Lanka, and I see it's not only about the individual and her livelihood. We have to go back to political economy analysis, as is analysis of foreign policy, and to talk about infrastructure, to talk about macroeconomic development and the feminist aspect of it. And feminist foreign policy must engage in those kinds of debates, not only about, giving grants to people to do handicrafts or something like that. See, and I think that's very crucial. That whole idea that political economy comes back into the discourse of foreign policy. And then, of course, feminists from the Global South have always been about women's voices. And any feminist foreign policy from the Global South must make sure that women's voices are heard and reflected, and that the consultation with the women's groups and intermediaries is constant, and placing them forward instead to where it is relevant. So I'll just sum up by just saying, I think when we think about feminist foreign policy from the South, we can accept some of the important aspects of Northern feminist foreign policy, the notion of representation, but not in militaries and those kinds of things, but maybe in our own foreign services and in our own Department of Finance, those kinds of things. We can accept concepts of human security as long as we don't gloss over the issues that exist in our society, such as human rights, because human security is often put forward as a way of getting over human rights. But I think we have to recognize that the South has very specific issues. Decolonization for one, both political, economic, and cultural. We have intersectionality, especially for our most vulnerable. I mean, it's just terrible to put on the TV and hear all these people raving and ranting against Southern people who are migrants to the North. We have to fight for them. It's very important. And then political economy to come back on the agenda from a feminist perspective. And finally, to make sure that Southern voices are heard at all the tables internationally. So I'll just leave it at that. I hope I'm within 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Radhika, for this wonderful intervention where we've kind of shown how we can take some of the essences from Northern debates, but always contextualize with the debates within the Global South feminists on decolonization, etc. And I'm going to throw the floor open for a few questions and comments. If you have them, please put it in the chat box because I cannot see any as yet. So before they come, maybe I would raise one issue which is bothering me. And in this current context, to especially Radhika and Emilia and Christa, that the Global South's position on non-alignment and neutrality, none of these countries who advocated and advocate still non-alignment and neutrality in these wars, though they support very strongly a two-state solution to Palestine, but none of them say they have a feminist foreign policy. But if you are non-aligned between warring military blocs, between old Cold Wars and new Cold Wars, I see that as a small aspect of a kind of an essence of a feminist foreign policy without saying it. Of course, a lot of countries in the Global South have become very transactional and they have this neoliberal elite which is expressing their foreign policy. But nonetheless, they've been forced into this position. So I wonder what your response is to that. If we begin, Emilia, would you like to respond very briefly?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I think I can speak from the specificity, for instance, of Mexico. We had been demanding of them to cut ties with Israel, and I don't think the feminists in Mexico were using the feminist foreign policy to call them out. We were just expecting to do the decent thing. But then Mexico's government didn't do that. And then later in time, we realized that Mexico was promoting a process and joining South Africa in the process in the ICC, in the ICJ against Israel. So they needed to maintain the diplomatic ties in order to promote the process. So I think this is really important in how governments are trying to, that are more progressive, that are trying to do a larger interpretation of what is their mandate. And Mexico has always been saying that it has a neutrality in terms of conflicts. But then in the face of genocide, Mexico also said that they cannot just watch and see Israel with impunity. So I think it is also about the way not only a victory for the feminist movement, but very much from the left progressive human rights movements in the Global South that we have been pushing, as we know, that process has been accompanied by many Global South countries and none by the Global North. So this is precisely what we're saying in terms of coherence of progressive governments in the Global South that are trying to make a difference also in this imperial world order, as opposed to what we see in the hypocritical way that Global North are co-opting our agendas.
Okay, so now suddenly there are a couple of questions, so I want to read them out. One is, what do you do you think could be the immediate steps or ways through which decolonization of foreign policy in the global South can be done? To what extent feminist foreign policy principles, which in itself is a new phenomena, will be helpful, especially when it has huge Western and Eurocentric alienation? I think it probably means... there's another question which says, can you suggest some good books? I think on feminist foreign policy with context to India and in general, maybe we can put some good books in the chat so we don't have to answer that right away. And then one question from Lalita Ramdas, an old friend, who says that it was good to hear the critique from the German point of view. Especially now, we are so deeply concerned about the support to Israel from countries like Germany, in addition, of course, to the US. And so I think these are the...
There are two more questions in the Q&A part, if you can see down
there are
below.
two more questions in the Q&A. Yeah, that is, any allegations of a feminist foreign policy by states is a delusion. This is from Nicole, and a dangerous fallacy. If not all governments are interested in stockpiling weapons for state security and engaging in development priorities that satisfy their egos and make them look good in the eyes of their counterparts, they don't care for human-centered policies and development initiatives. So this is more of a comment. And I think Emilia really addressed that. And another anonymous attendee says, or asks, how do feminist scholars look at the issue of climate change? Is there any difference over climate change between global North feminists and global South feminist scholars? So I'm going to ask all three panelists to address this very quickly before we go on to the next set of panelists and more questions. So should we begin with Emilia? Or maybe, did you already answer? Anyway, you can have 2-3 minutes to answer.
Thank you. I just want to tackle the issue of climate change because there is a major difference between what we see that are being pushed from our global North colleagues that are calling for a Green New Deal. And that is very much still a colonial framework in which they're calling for a transition towards renewable energies. And that means effectively, without calling for a system change in the global North, calling for degrowth also of concentration of wealth and harmful sectors, and to carry out definitely all of the efforts of mitigation that need to happen globally, need to happen in the global North. So by doing that, calling for the global New Deal, what they're doing is calling out for a new green imperialism and green colonialism in the global South, for extraction of the green and for the critical minerals that are needed for the green transition to happen again in the global South, and therefore destroying the ecosystems integrity that we still have in the global South, to impose mega projects and again processes of privatization, militarization alongside the mega projects, etc. So this is really important for us. The Global South is calling for a comprehensive transformation of the system, economic system as a whole, and definitely calling out the responsibility of the Global North, including calling for reparations in terms of climate finance and loss and damage, and highlighting the importance of adaptation. So there is a major difference, and so this is why we are, in my eyes, we do not only need to call out for the issue of the problematic nature of feminist foreign policy, but definitely of the problematic nature of white feminism and the type of feminism that is mainstream in the global North, that is not up to date with the colonial and imperial dynamics, that they themselves are also complicit by not attacking the extraterritorial impacts of the policies of the global North. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Christa, if you would.
Yeah, I would be very hesitant to make up boxes of global South feminist scholars and global North feminist scholars. Then I would be put in the global North feminist scholars. And I have seen the Green New Deal and very, very critical. And I follow very much Farhana Sultana's notion of the invariable burden of coloniality in the present climate policies. An example is the misuse of women and indigenous communities in trade in emissions in so-called red projects. And there are very critical feminist scholars about this in the North as well. And it is, my perspective is much more that we try to build front of solidarity, bringing again, as was said by Radhika, political economy back into foreign policies and environment policies as well. And I would say we only have a chance if we join hands between North and South, and if feminist scholars from the North take up the decolonization responsibility for themselves from the North as well. I consider it my task as a scholar as well to decolonize policies, be it foreign policies, be it environmental policies or climate policies. We should work together from different directions and influence post-colonial policies.
Thank you. Radhika?
Yes, well, let me just say some of the decolonization things of feminist foreign policies in the South could do is first in the Political and Security Council to push for a much more global representation with regard to economic decolonization. There's so much that can be done, so much written and done with regard especially to debt and power structures that govern us. So, I mean, I think there are so many things scholars already have outlined in the different areas with what we can do with regard to decolonization. But one thing I want to do is the question, the comment made that nothing, everybody is just into hardware and this is none of this soft stuff. And I agree, because recently there's a book written by this man called Nate Silver, where he has been studying decision-making patterns in America and the West in tech billionaires or hedge fund managers or people like Mr. Trump and others, in this whole way of decision-making that is like poker playing and risk-taking and a whole style that has no interest in people, absolutely no interest in how people carry, not that they ever had, but there's no room in that. And in that world, when we talk about feminist foreign policy and human security, it's very difficult. And as she says, it'll likely just not go anywhere. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. There are some more questions, but we will leave it for, after the second round of panelists. We'll put those questions later. So in the second round, may I now call upon Shereen Talaat from Egypt. Shereen?
Hello, thanks a lot, and thanks for my sisters who already spoke. And I agree. I don't think that we can speak about feminist foreign policies without speaking about the political microeconomic approach, and definitely the ecological and the climate lens of it, which is actually doesn't. I cannot say it exists in a proper way. It's not only the SRHR, but it's we need to understand the austerity impacts on women. We need to understand the debt impact on women, and we need to understand the climate impact on women. And my only problem is, well, I'll tell you my own story. I was following, and I was invited to participate in the process of the German feminist foreign policy since the first beginning. And I was very ambitious, and it was sort of, because we are invited as voices from the global South as feminists, so it has the sense of inclusion and transparency, but yet still it's only on papers. And this is not me judging. This is the reality. I'm representing feminists from the MENA region, which you all know that we are living under war, and the war that it is expanding and expanding and expanding. And just yesterday, women, children were melting alive in their tents in Palestine. So, and yet, what the feminist foreign policy did to these women? Nothing. The German, for example, federal representation was one of the first to vote against seizing the fire, either in the EU or the UN. So that actually tells us a lot about how the intention. I mean, like, I'm not. I mean, good, very good for Germany, for Sweden, for the US to have a full feminist foreign policy, but yet still foreign for whom? Because when it comes to implication, when it comes to reality, when it comes to the what is really happening on the ground, there is nothing. In contrary, they are endorsing violence. Voting against ceasefire is endorsing violence against women. And it's not only about the human rights-based approach, it's about the feminist-based approach. Feminist-based approach is the, I believe, is more inclusion even than because of the intersectional sense, more inclusive than the human rights-based approach, but yet still, this is apparently something due to the status quo that we are only raising and discussing among us in the global South. But what is the real impact? I mean, like, is under the genocide time that we're living under, and the climate crisis, or as my colleague Emilia always say, the ecological collapse that we're living under. Can we see this implication? No, we can't. We can't, because it doesn't exist. The first thing that Sweden did after the Russia-Ukrainian war is to cut on the feminist budget. This was the first thing, for the sake of the militarization and the budget for military. That was the first thing to be done, and that will be always the first thing. That will give us a sense on how what is the priority of this feminist policies and approaches. And I now have a belief that it was only a tick on the box. I mean, if we are in our countries, I'm speaking, if I was a northern country, if we are in our countries living in peace, that is very good. Let's put a foreign policy for people to know that we're feminist, and that's it. But that is really from the global South benefiting us in any time? I mean, like, and please do not speak about women economical empowerment, like entrepreneurs and this kind of or even women participating in the political spaces in our countries, because it's actually related to more colonial approach. You will find that it's always related to the programs that the IMF is imposing in our country, related to projects that is implemented by the World Bank and other, EBRD or EIB or whatever, the European arms of development are. So it is a colonial approach, and I mean, like, I don't want to use the term new colonial, because the colonialism didn't end, but it is taking different forms, as we can say now, under the name of the feminist foreign policies and other policies around. Going back to the region that I'm coming from, there is war everywhere. Women and children are the most, I mean, the wood of this fire, unfortunately. And if we're speaking about aid as a central part of the central approaches of the foreign feminist policies, it doesn't even exist. Doesn't exist in Sudan. We know nothing about Sudan. It doesn't exist in definitely Palestine, and now we're having Lebanon on board. So I will stop here and open for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shereen, for this passionate intervention with which I think there is a consensus here that policies which harm women, any state which says it's feminist foreign policy their foreign policy and other policies are harming women in other countries cannot really be called a feminist foreign policy. It's a bit of a facade. So I would ask Patricia Munoz Cabrera to speak next. Patricia?
Good evening. I am very pleased to be part of this webinar. In my presentation today, I will focus on Chile's feminist foreign policy and its relationship with decolonial feminist approaches. I am originally from Chile, a country which has joined the list of countries to have a so-called feminist foreign policy on paper. I would like to start by saying that Chile has an important indigenous population. Historically, indigenous women have been in the forefront of decolonial resistance against the harmful impacts of capitalist-driven extractivism, in particular extractive mining and agribusiness for export. Their struggle has produced robust knowledges which have nourished decolonial feminist agendas throughout Latin America, contributing to reimagining futures embedded in social justice, caring economies, and violence-free development models. Unfortunately, the knowledge produced by indigenous women in Chile is missing from the feminist foreign policy framework currently proposed by the Chilean government. And they are not the only missing subjects. Rural women, migrant women, women active in the informal economy and in the care economy are also missing. Their invisibility is in sharp contrast with the purported inclusive nature of Chile's feminist foreign policy and even contradicts the so-called feminist narratives embedded in the policy itself. So far, no country has put forward a genuinely decolonial feminist foreign policy, and Chile is no exception to the rule. Close analysis of its feminist foreign policy shows that the country is firmly anchored in the current model of global consumerist capitalism. There is weak reference in the document to actual enforcement mechanisms to guarantee prevention and respect of women's human rights on the ground, including protection from any harm caused by international trade, policies, and operations. In this sense, we may argue that the country's feminist foreign policy confirms the government's intention to expand penetration of global markets through internationalization of its company and to bring home the necessary profit to refloat its economy. It is assumed that international trade will have a positive impact on women's economic empowerment. Women defined as a highly homogeneous social group. In theory, Chile's feminist foreign policy covers several important targets of the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. And many of those proposed areas are already part of existing commitments the country has made in the framework of, for example, Beijing recommendations, CEDAW, ILO conventions and protocols on women's labor rights, including decent work, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So, what is really innovative about Chile's feminist foreign policy? Not much, we may argue, except for increased awareness by policymakers and civil servants of the need to integrate women's rights, needs and priorities in foreign policy, while at the same time showing linkages between the international and the national contextual realities. In practice, however, the feminist foreign policy proposed has no substantial monitoring system in terms of tangible transformative outcomes. Like a majority of current feminist foreign policy frameworks, the Chilean one remains mostly discursive, highly rhetorical, and in contradiction with the actual aggressive trade expansion of the country's planned agenda for macroeconomic growth at the expense of human rights and nature's rights. Furthermore, due to its strong focus on international trade, it will be mostly empowering for women from upper classes and those from highly educated groups who are able to participate and compete in international trade opportunities. The empowerment assumption, nevertheless, will not hold true for a majority of Chilean women. And the major reason for this is that in Chile, welfare gains are not distributed equitably. In fact, Chile is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America, according to OECD recent data from 2022. Moreover, its foreign policy agenda focuses on trade expansion through extractive mining and agribusiness, both of which are exacerbating social conflict and gender-based violence on the ground. Moreover, trade openness will perpetuate power asymmetries within heterogeneous groups of women who, as I have argued, are assumed as a homogeneous category by the current feminist foreign policy. The geopolitical dimension of global north and global south power asymmetries becomes more palpable when one analyzes one of the three pillars of the recently signed, modernized trade agreement between Chile and the European Union, namely the political cooperation pillar. In this pillar, it is stated that the main objective of the political dialogue between both parties will be the promotion, dissemination, and common defense of democratic values, among which are respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. While this may sound promising on paper, the current geopolitical context of conflict and war in Palestine and Ukraine, for example, may have implications for Chile in the sense that the country would be faced in the future with alignment to European Union stance on these regions that would not be shared by a majority of the Chilean population. More concretely, many Chilean citizens, many members of the government and members of parliament have condemned the massacres in Gaza, while EU member states have to a large extent been silent at best or supportive of Israel at worst. If both parties are treating each other on equal terms, how come that the European Union has not aligned with Chile and several other countries of the global south who are calling for an end to the historical occupation of Palestinian territories, to stop the killing of civilians in Gaza, to respect their rule of law, and to abide with international legal frameworks. These are lingering questions, and even if countries fail to do so, a decolonial feminist approach to foreign policy should engage with those crucial issues. In sum, a decolonial approach to feminist foreign policy calls for a total rejection of the geopolitics of power, informing engagement by global North countries with ongoing conflicts in several regions of the global South. Some key elements of a decolonial approach to feminist foreign policy are as follows. Several transformative pathways from decolonial feminist thinking have been put forward to counter the historical subordination and invisibility of intersectionally discriminated women in foreign policy. And a decolonial feminist approach in foreign policy exposes the colonial dimensions of current social and economic development models, both at the local and global level. Why is this important? Because these models are enshrined in colonial legacies and unfettered accumulation of wealth and power by global and national elites. Colonial legacies have indeed perpetuated harm and suffering, as the occupation of Palestine and invasion of Ukraine demonstrates. A feminist foreign policy that does not take stock of these legacies cannot call itself feminist. A decolonial feminist approach also proposes alternative development and economic approaches that place environmental and social justice at the heart of sustainable socio-ecological well-being, while withdrawing the balance between state, market, society, nature relations, human rights-based multilateralism, and transnational solidarities among countries engaged in peace building rather than occupation and war making. Indeed, a fundamental principle of a decolonial feminist policy should be rejection of the violence generated by colonial legacies, including elitist construction of nation states, territorial colonization and occupation, and state violence, which is often met with impunity. In addition to exposing colonial legacies as they inform current international relations, and in particular trade and development policies and practices, a feminist decolonial approach compels us to move beyond gender mainstreaming. In fact, it rejects any foreign policy that promotes gender equality and women's representation within the current structures and norms of ruling ideologies such as patriarchy, racism, heteronormativity, and consumerist capitalism. A decolonial feminist approach locates gender equality as one of the several mechanisms of intersectional discrimination, disempowerment, and disenfranchisement. It highlights the importance of justice in its multi-layered forms and enforcement possibilities, for example, through recognitional justice and distributive justice. The ultimate goal is not more women in power within a power system that perpetuates inequalities, but equity in distribution of wealth, voice, and decision-making power on policies and practices, which have a direct impact on women's material lives, livelihoods, and enjoyment of their fundamental rights. I would like to close with a few questions which I personally find worth considering when designing, implementing, and assessing a feminist foreign policy from a decolonial and intersectional feminist standpoint. Number one, the first question I can think of is, to what extent does the proposed feminist foreign policy framework expose colonial legacies, mindsets, power mechanisms, and their resulting conflicts and social injustices? Number two, to what extent does it propose concrete actions to debunk those legacies in the spirit of preventing the violence and instability resulting from conflict, war, colonization, invasion, and forced displacement? Three, in what demonstrable way can a given feminist foreign policy effectively influence a state's foreign policy so that it complies with national and international legislation guaranteeing the human rights of all women and men at the domestic and international levels? Lastly, by which mechanisms will countries embed decolonial feminist principles in their mainstream policy, foreign policy goals? Or will feminist foreign policies always be a separate chapter or even an annex of mainstream foreign policy documents? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia, for this wonderfully holistic presentation and bringing in all this. We will share the PowerPoint later, as Priti has promised. And lastly, Shweta Singh from the South Asia University. Shweta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anu. And it's wonderful hearing all the voices. And I think it's one of the few instances where voices from the global South talking about a decolonial project are all together. I was asked, when I was thinking about, I thought I'll bring in India's position. And I think I'll come in from the standpoint of India. And I think to start the story, and I think that's where many of the voices would converge also. I think one of the key questions is the question of label. Feminist foreign policy or a gender responsive foreign policy? And I think this question is important if you're thinking about India's position, because India is very hesitant to use the label of feminist foreign policy. And I think I've been thinking about this question, and I think it's important to reflect on this question from the standpoint of location. And if you're looking at a country like India, and I think this is something which would speak to us in the global South, the question of genealogy of feminist foreign policy becomes extremely important. And I think why I'm talking about this question of feminist foreign policy, and I'm going to just, bring in the voice of the External Affairs Minister of India, who in 2021 states, I agree that we need to look at the world from the perspective of women. We need a gender balanced foreign policy. We need to look at three things here: getting more women to engage with foreign policy issues, reflect on women's interests in foreign policy, and bring in a feminist perspective to foreign policy. He went on to acknowledge the need for rebalancing in India's foreign policy, but emphasized, and I underline that, but emphasized that any such policy cannot simply be imported from countries in the West, as these countries have different cultures, different historical traditions, and we need to evolve a framework that is organic, that organically speaks to India. And I think it's here that I'm coming back in to the question of semantics or label. And I think I do want to emphasize that when we are thinking about this politics of label, there are two D's that we need to be thinking about. One is dialogue and the other is difference. And I think Radhika very beautifully talked about how we are in dialogue with some of the norms that are coming in from the global north, especially centered around the ideas of human security, but we are also in diffidence and indifference. And I think I want to come back to the question of difference. Now, if you're looking at the question of genealogy of feminist foreign policy and the politics of location, I think states, post-colonial states like India would be very hesitant because there is a very rich history in the context of the ideas of feminist politics and the way it has translated in the realm of foreign policy. And I think if you're looking at the way the current genealogy of feminist foreign policy is projected, with it centered around the global north, I think it's more about the idea of exclusions than inclusions. And I think it's here that we need to come back and see a rich history or a rich trajectory or a rich genealogy of India's engagement with both feminist ethics and feminist principles. And if I go down into history, I think what is important really is that if you're thinking about a gender sensitive foreign policy, or if you're thinking about a feminist foreign policy, we need to first problematize the genealogy itself. So if I go down into the context of plural histories, I do want to talk about the feminist strategic thought, which actually goes back to 6th century BC, in a text called Therigatha. Now, the Therigatha is a very interesting text. If I look at the Therigatha as a text, it was written by the Buddhist monks, the first Buddhist monks who were women, who were called the Theris, and the ideas of relationality and a non-hierarchical world order and ideas of feminist utopia were embedded in this history way back in the 6th century BC. So how do we actually turn around and talk about a genealogy which is very modern and centered around the 6th century idea? How do we talk about a genealogy that is centered around the global north? So this is a slippery terrain. And why it is a slippery terrain is because I also want to highlight that this ideas of a post-colonial, decolonial project can also be appropriated by the populist radical right in the global south. So this is a very thin, slippery terrain that we are walking through when we are talking about the politics of genealogy and histories in the global south, particularly in India. Now, if I talk about it in the current context and going on and building on my point on how India has really embraced the idea of feminist ethics and principles without embracing the terminology of feminist foreign policy, I'm going to echo what Professor Chenoy was talking about. Since 1947, India has been talking about the ideas of non-alignment. It's been talking about the context of multilateralism. It has been talking about the whole context of a non-hierarchical world order. And this has been through the 1940s, 1950s. We are seeing the current ramification of it, for instance, in the context of India's position in terms of not aligning with either sides of the blocks that we are talking about. So I think the key point is we need to pay attention to how states are embracing feminist ethics and principles and tracing them down to their own feminist histories and genealogy. And I think that's an important question. And I think what it would also push for is to problematize the idea of universalism that is embedded in the 3 R's that we are talking about. The second point that I want to draw attention to is the question of state self-identity. And I think the question of state self-identity is extremely important. If we look at the way the framing in the global north is, the framing has been ideas around moral exceptionalism, something which Sweden is talking about, or many of the other countries in the global north, even Germany to a great extent. But if you come back to India and its post-colonial identity, I think it's again very attentive to how it constructs its idea of state identity. And now in the case of India, this is deeply rooted in its post-colonial experience and the politics of civilization and modernity. Now, India is acutely attentive, and I want to underline this, India is acutely attentive to how the West inscribes India and how discursively India produces its own self-identity. Now, this is where, if you're looking at the label of feminist foreign policy, a post-colonial state like India is very hesitant to deploy an exported or an outwardly oriented template of feminist foreign policy. And this is really pertinent because it also has this whole context of how, despite this strategic hesitancy, there is a push to embrace the idea of gender responsive foreign policy. And I think if you're looking at it, the push that I'm trying to underline is that if you're talking about a cross-cutting regional dialogue, we need to push for a decolonial, cosmopolitan thinking on ideas of feminist foreign policy, something that Patricia was also talking about. So I'm going to echo that. The third important point that I thought I'm going to talk about is the synergy. And I think this is where feminist foreign policy in the global south has a huge lacunae. The synergy is in the context of cross-cutting inter-regional dialogue. And when I say cross-cutting inter-regional dialogue, I also want to emphasize on the point of the need for intra-regional dialogue. So for instance, how would ideas on if you're talking about, Radhika was talking about economic decolonization, cultural decolonization, and political decolonization. Now, if I'm looking at three literal contexts in South Asia itself, Maldives, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, there is a lot of synergy in the context of economic decolonization that we are talking about. If you're looking at India and Nepal, there's a lot of synergy in the context of political decolonization that we are talking about. But I think platforms for engagement on inter-regional and intra-regional feminist solidarity networks stand very minimal as opposed to the WPS agenda that we were talking about and the synergy that the WPS agenda was able to push. So I think in that context, I would really say that the road ahead is long, but it's important to take cognizance of perspectives of states like India, where post-colonial identities continue to play a role in terms of both its dialogue and dissidence to the idea of feminist foreign policy. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shweta, for bringing in a lot of the threads. There were some questions, and I really want to bring in the audience as much as possible. We've had so many people here. And one question from the earlier panel is from Chantal Umuhoza. And she says anyone in the panel can answer. And she says that we need to first question the relevance, structure, and operationing of global North foreign policies. Do they even have to exist? Their existence is colonial to begin with. We can't call colonialism feminist. It's simply an oxymoron. So that's one question comment to everyone that I can see. Then
there is one more from Yuvraj Das, which has just come. If you want to just
I'm going to
summarizing that.
I'm just going through all of them. There's another one again from Chantal, which says maybe they should call it a decolonial foreign policy. Then we can speak about accountability of how that would look like. Then Yuvraj Das says that in the context of India, the political leadership has been increasingly concerned with building India's military arsenal due to neighborhood interregional rivalries and has deepened its military trade with genocidal countries. The administration in general pursued a hyper-masculine foreign policy. How can a feminist foreign policy principle push back against this growing trend? Will these feminist principles continue to be marginalized in the current political climate? And again, from Nidhi Prakash, ma'am, please link the books related to feminist foreign policy with contexts to India also. So please do give some recommendations of books and articles, though I'm telling Nidhi that if you email Priti, she can give you several important articles which we have collected on this issue, and maybe some books and booklets also. Priti has put her official email in the chat. So Nidhi Prakash, please do look at that. In the meanwhile, if all our panelists can, because we're really also running short of time, if they can answer the questions and also sum up. So I'm going to give each of them 2-3 minutes. You can either answer the 2 comments, questions, and also sum up. So we begin with Christa.
Yes, I really would like to stress in the end again that I refuse to be put in a homogeneous block of North scholarship or a Northern perspective on foreign policies. I'm coming from political economy and a very critical perspective, and I want to talk with my friends from the Global South about spaces where we can develop further our synergies, well knowing about our differences, but full of respect for each other, and where we can develop some solidarity. For example, in discussing the question, do we have universal feminist principles, or don't we have universal feminist principles anymore? But I'm very much interested to look for, in the future, for further spaces to discuss this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so Emilia, would you?
I'm sorry, I think our colleagues from the second panel need to reply. They haven't given any floor. I just want to say that people in the global north shouldn't center themselves when we're talking about something that affects us all globally. Thank you.
Okay, so Shereen Talaat.
Yes, thank you, and I mean, like for the last reflection, feminist foreign policies or not feminist foreign policy, this whole system and how it goes, and how the North is leading whatever is related to feminism or human rights is not the right thing. This whole system needs to pause and to be reconstructed again in a non-imperial, non-colonial, and a feminist green way. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so Patricia, would you respond?
Patricia, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, to me, one crucial
Yes.
issue is how do we really push forward to whether it is decolonial feminist policy, feminist and decolonial, intersectional feminist policy, how do we engage with power structures? What are the uses of power? What is the exercise of power that we want to put forward in our transnational feminist discussions? I think that this is important. And also leadership. To what extent women's leaders represent the priorities and the political, economic, and cultural realities of women they say they represent. I think those issues, power, leadership, spaces of representation, agency, are extremely important. And I join Christa in her call to begin by decolonizing our idea that the global south is per se a bad space and that the global south is per se a victim or a site of oppression, because I am from Chile, from Belgium, mixed indigenous European. So it depends on what we think of the world we live in, and the materiality of our existence matters enormously. Issues like social justice, equity in distribution of wealth, voice and power, these are the issues that to me deserve to be put inside any foreign policy that we need to see in the world, in the future world.
Thank you. So Shweta, would you answer Yubraj's question very briefly, because he's arguing that in the current context, India is really building up it's becoming very militarized, hyper-masculine foreign policies, and how the feminists can push back in the current climate where India is presenting itself as a regional hegemon, even if it opposes some external hegemons.
Thank you so much, Professor Chenoy. I think I would echo and agree with you, Braj, completely. And I think this is the paradox that Christa has highlighted, even in the context of Germany. So there is always this paradox. And if we look at India's position, it's very interesting how India would talk about being a moral normative power, but at the same time, we are also talking about its positions in the context of neighborhood. There is a distinction in the context of positions in the neighborhood and the outer neighborhood, if I can talk about. So there are these many paradoxes that we are talking about in the structural constraints. How can feminists push for it? I think this is where we have to start talking about go beyond the state. And I think this is where I was talking about my third point in terms of how do we start to talk about out leveraging regional civil society networks, local civil society networks, national civil society networks, in terms of a cross-cutting conversations, not just within the region, but also inter-regional conversations. And I think the way in the context of WPS we've been talking about NAPs, I think the road ahead for a feminist foreign policy is much longer. Very quick point, something that I also want to highlight, that when we are talking about a decolonial project, or even when we are talking about the whole context of post-colonial anxieties, we also need to be very attentive to how the populist radical right is also appropriating the language of decolonization. So this is a slippery terrain when we start to talk about questions on genealogies and histories. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Shweta, for clarifying. Radhika, your last few comments and your responses.
Thank you. First, on the last point, I think it's really important because the way our states and the right wing are using the language of decolonization to prop up really authoritarian and extremely reactionary situation is something that we have to be concerned about, even as we talk about the progressive need of decolonization. But let me just go back to Christa's point, which is, in the history of the women's movement, and now, I'm quite old now, so I've seen it over time. There are ideas that originate in different parts of the island, but even something like CEDAW first originated mainly in the northern countries, and then was adopted and grew. And so I think that because it's adopted, it began in Canada and Sweden, there should not be rejection of it, but to evaluate it and see how relevant some of those aspects are to us in the global South, but to also realize, as Shweta said, the differences differences that there exist. And as Christa says, it's not really people, but the ideas that we're talking about. So, there are people in the North who are very Southern in their thoughts and ideas. And there are people in the South who are very Northern in their thoughts and ideas. So it's not really dealing with, but I think it's really important to create a global solidarity. And doing that global solidarity, and if you're talking like issues such as feminist foreign policy, we have to first look at the nature of our state. Do we want to even be involved with the state? Because foreign policy is that of a state. And secondly, we have to see how we can have the global dialogue about issues such as decolonization, political economy, all that, as well as raise all, as she says, the Chilean foreign policy raises the women's issues, right? So there's violence against women, there's abortion. So that's one aspect, but there's also the structural aspect of international relations that feminist foreign policy should also raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Actually, you made my work much lighter, but by summing up what I was going to say, but there are one or two comments, and I'd be very remiss if I didn't read them. They're just comments, but one from Chantal again, and she says, all global North states that have launched feminist foreign policies also oppose global North progressive language in UN spaces, including TRIPS, transfer of intellectual property rights for pandemic preparedness and other issues. They also run extractivist economic activities in the global North, including the sale of harmful agricultural products to South. They contradict themselves at all key levels of global South people's livelihood. We need to publish more research on these contradictions of feminist foreign policy champions, and not a question. This is not a question, just a comment. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comments, Chantal. You've been a very interactive part of this dialogue. And Emilia, who is our panelist, she also has an important comment, I think, where she says that the global unequal exchange between North and South is unquestionable. Lalita Ramdas says that will we have access to a recording? Yes, a lot of people have asked this. You will all get access to a recording of this very important webinar, and it will be on the BRICS Feminist Watch and AEPF websites also. So just therefore, if everyone has, all the panelists, if they don't have any more comments to add, I would just briefly sum up with 2 or 3 points, because it was too rich to get all the points in. But we would also, I think, maybe send the points, because I will do an entire collection of the points made. And in that, I think what we've all agreed to is, one, that our states cannot have a feminist foreign policy unless they have a feminist domestic policy, unless we are rid of patriarchy in our relations within states. Then we also agreed that states cannot really appropriate this title of feminist foreign policy, because they're not really using feminist principles. And what they mean by feminist foreign policy is not what the rest of us critical, decolonized, intersectional feminists believe is feminist foreign policy. Primarily, what they're arguing about is just representation and resources, but not how feminists just joining a position of power in a national security board and harming other women, harming other countries through all the policies that we've talked about, whether it is how they behave or how they endorse the policies of occupation, apartheid, extractivism, asymmetries of power, that if you accept that, then it cannot, just because you're a woman in foreign policy structure, you cannot appropriate this argument that it's a feminist foreign policy. So, and the third point, I think, was that these kind of labels of just North versus South are insufficient. Of course, they are there. The North is the hegemonic colonial power, former colonial, but there are epistemic communities in that who use the similar frameworks, and there are oppressing communities in the South who are being co-opted into and want to be, they have what we call strategic mirroring of Northern policies. So I think we could conclude here. I want to thank everyone for this wonderful webinar, and I hand it over to Priti again.
Thank you so much, Anu. That was really fabulous. I'm really grateful to all the panelists for your wisdom and for really pushing this conversation, which is what was required. When we were conceptualizing this webinar, part of us were thinking that there is so much conversation happening in this space, but how is it that we can really challenge our thinking into a conversation that we really need to have amongst ourselves? So thanks to all of you who brought this wisdom and challenged us and pushed this conversation further in challenging what feminist principles are, what the state role is, and also questioning the North-South role and relationships in the current global environment. So I really want to thank each one of you for joining us, for the generosity of your time. And I really appreciate the engaged participation also. I know these webinars are a bit like, we've gotten used to since COVID to have this, but I really appreciate all the sharing that happened in the chat, and we were able to extract some of the comments and questions from there. So Anu, thank you so much for anchoring this. I don't know how I would have done it without you. And I want to really appreciate all our partners, AEPF, the South Asian University in Delhi. So this is a beginning. We hope we continue this conversation. Let's see how we unpack, because I think today we were willing to go and push some of this discourse further. So let's continue having these conversations and have a wonderful evening or morning, depending upon what part of the world you are. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Thank you.